before we get to today's speaker. There is no speaker series next Wednesday, but Tuesday afternoon from 3 to 5, we have one of our periodic Capital Insights panels. This one is on adolescent development. It's sort of like 4 weddings and a funeral. There's actually, I guess there's 4 professors and a superintendent. So it'll feature the superintendent of the Sacramento Public School District. And should be a very robust discussion with a lot of expertise to share. Today's talk is not so unrelated, since cannabis certainly has some connection to adolescent development, among many other important issues. So it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Danielle Piomelli from University of California, Irvine. Professor Piomelli has worked with some of the great names in the field, including, as you can read, 2 Nobel Prize winners. He trained at Columbia and the Rockefeller Institute, and he's been doing cannabis-related research since 1992. So he was truly an early adopter, an early innovator in this field. So he's again, as you can read on his bio, he's published over 400 research articles. He's the recipient of many awards, and he's the co-founder of the Center for the Study of Cannabis at UC Irvine, which includes not just medical and physiologically oriented people, but also attorneys and legal scholars. So here to sort of shed some light on the cannabis issue from both a pharmacologic and that is scientific and a legal perspective, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Danielle Piomelli.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You can hear me, right? Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I was tasked today to bring together 2 topics, one which I'm very familiar with, the medical topic. The other one I'm a lot less familiar, the legal one. But I took the challenge, and hopefully the result will not be completely useless to you. So the title is Medical and Legal Challenges of Cannabis Legalization. So I think a good place to start is always history, understanding where we are based on where we are coming from. My first slide is a brief history of cannabis, our relationship to cannabis as a medicine. Our relationship as a species, as a human species, to cannabis is actually very, very old. There is archaeological and archaeobotanical evidence for human cultivation and use of cannabis that dates 10,000 years ago. So already 8,000 BC, before current era, people were using cannabis for a variety of reasons. As you know, cannabis is fiber, so it can be used for textiles. Cannabis is seed, so it can be used for food. And of course, if you want to get the seed, you have to go to the flower. And the flower contains a psychoactive component. So early hunter-gatherers and early Neolithic people, when they started cultivating cannabis, they discovered, we don't know that for a fact, but it's very likely, also the psychoactive effects. But that history is too long ago. It's a very interesting chapter, but I'm not going to go there. I'd like to start off when cannabis really became part of Western medicine, if I could use that term. And that year has a date, 1845, the mid of the 19th century. That's the year when the first real book on cannabis was published in French in the city of Paris by a French psychiatrist who entitled his book Hashish, which is one of the names that cannabis has, and mental disease. It's a 300-page book, very interesting reading, that describes in great detail the effects of cannabis and ventures also into some potential therapeutic applications for psychosis, interestingly enough. But that's not an area where I think we should go today. But 1845 was really when European scientists, and then soon after scientists in the United States, started to pay attention to cannabis. And in fact, a few years later, in 1854, cannabis was introduced for the first time in the United States pharmacopoeia. The pharmacopoeia, of course, is the manual that contains all the medicines, medications that can be used, can be sold in a pharmacy, right? So in 1854, cannabis became a medication that was sold throughout the United States as well as Europe for a variety of indications. Analgesia, painkilling, and antispasmodic were two of the indications that were listed in the USP. And it remained in the USP until 1942, when it was withdrawn. It was taken away. So what did not happen is that scientists had discovered some negative effects, and that was the reason for this withdrawal. That did not happen. What happened instead was this, was the introduction, the enactment of the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which essentially delegalized, criminalized the cultivation, possession, use of cannabis. Now, this put a substantial weight on science, and in the area of cannabis, research has been extremely slow, largely because of this legal constraints. Nevertheless, a few years later, during the wars, World War II, Roger Adams, a chemist in the United States, was able to extract from the plant, from the flowers and the leaves of the plant, a chemical, which when he injected in dogs, he found that it did exactly the same thing as the whole extract of cannabis would do. So he concluded this must be the active principle. This must be the compound responsible for the pharmacological effects of cannabis. He was right. He didn't have the complete structure, though, because in 1940s, a lot of the techniques that we have today, we didn't have. But 20 years later, Raphael Mechoulam in Jerusalem was able to complete that puzzle, complete the definition of the structure of the compound, and that's why I say that THC was discovered between 1944 and 1964. And that is the most important first step that science took, isolating the compound that is responsible for the intoxicating, inebriating effects of cannabis. Now, soon after, the illegality of cannabis was confirmed by the fairly famous, I believe, Controlled Substance Act of 1970. And that put another constraint on research. Now, the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional, but now with this, we have a very structured constitutional legal system whereby, and I'll talk some more about that later on, whereby we have to apply to, we have to follow certain rules and regulations in order to be able to perform research on cannabis, and that those regulations, those rules, we'll see in detail later on, are curbing research massively. Nonetheless, a few persistent scientists discovered between 88 and 1990 the reason why THC does what it does to our brains. They discovered a protein that is normally present on the cell surface, on the surface of cells in our brain, neurons. A protein that combines to THC just like a lock combines with a key, and when the key inside the lock, the door that opens is the effect of THC, and that those effects are numerous, some of which are of medical interest, and some of which are of more of neuroscience interest, but they're all quite interesting. So the discovery of the cannabinoid receptor was another momentous step in the scientific history of cannabis, and opened an important question. If we have receptors for cannabis, THC in cannabis, why do we have such receptors? Evolution does not put things in place without some kind of an adaptive reason. And the adaptive reason for the cannabinoid receptors is the brain-owned cannabis-like molecules. Our brain and the rest of our body makes molecules that, while on paper, you write their chemical structures, they don't look like THC. In space, when you make a model of them, they look just like one another. And so these endogenous cannabinoid compounds, or endocannabinoids, are what THC mimics when people use it. So the discovery of the endocannabinoid system was the last, I think, the culmination of this 50 years of discoveries. And it might have, in small amount, contributed to change in spirit throughout the nation. Because now, we're 2019, but already in 2018, when I made this slide, there are a number of states in the Union, 30, plus the District of Columbia, that have legalized cannabis for medicinal purposes. Some of them, including our state of California, also for adult recreational use. So there is a sea shift, a sea change that is really rather historic, I believe, and poses a number of interesting questions. So with this as a very brief historical background, how does cannabis work? I already told you, let me just reiterate this point. The reason why people feel intoxicated, feel inebriated with cannabis is only one. It has a name, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. This molecule here, and the way THC works is no mystery to us. It binds to these receptors, which are very abundant in the brain, and the activation of those receptors underpins the inebriation, the intoxication. The main reason why people use it for recreational purposes. There are other reasons, medical, and some of these are underpinned also by the cannabinoid receptors. We'll look into that a little bit more later on. I spoke about cannabinoid receptors. There are two subtypes, and we don't really need to learn much about this. What I would like to point out is just one important thing. The cannabinoid receptor is very, very abundant in the brain. The subtype that is abundant in the brain is this guy here, the CB1 receptor. In fact, it's so abundant, it's the single most abundant receptor in our brain. That's a mystery. That's an interesting statement, right? So the receptor for THC is more abundant than the receptor for, say, dopamine or serotonin. You have heard about these transmitters, right? And it's this guy here, the CB1 receptor. But the CB1 receptor is also present in almost every single cell and tissue and organ system in our body, where it does things that are not what we think about when we think about cannabis. When we think about cannabis, we think about being high, being stoned. That's what we think about. We don't think about regulating liver function. We don't think about regulating white adipose tissue function. We don't think about regulating blood pressure. But those are functions that the endogenous cannabinoid system play. That is what we need to know to fully understand what cannabis does to the body, both acutely and chronically. The impact of cannabis on the body is not just on the brain. It's also outside the brain because this receptor is everywhere. The other receptor here, CB2, is a lot more mysterious, is only present in cells of the immune system. Those cells are very, very important, but we don't know what that receptor does in those cells. We don't. We have some data suggesting it may involve the regulation of pain, innate immunity, not very, very clear. So let me go back to the brain. This is just a representation of where in the brain the receptor is. The denser the color, the denser the expression of the receptor. So here, this is a portion called the cerebellum, a ton of receptor. These are the so-called basal ganglia, a ton of receptor. This is actually the place where we have more cannabinoid CB1 receptor than anywhere else in the brain. This is the cortex. Now, the brain works like this. Certain regions do certain things. Other regions do other things. That's the way the brain works. So, for example, the cerebellum controls motoric coordination. The frontal cortex controls higher thought processes, personality. So the CB1 is everywhere, but in certain areas more than in others. But we could say that almost each of the effects that cannabis has on people, the psychological effects, can be referred to an area of the brain where there is a cannabinoid receptor, a family group of cannabinoid receptors that they're regulating activity in that area of the brain. So the reason why we have cannabinoid receptors is because we have our own cannabinoid system. And this system is called the endocannabinoid system. It's a neurotransmitter system that, just like the cannabinoid receptor, is everywhere in the body. Everywhere in the body. There are two main endocannabinoids. They are interesting because they are not like any other neurotransmitter in the body. They are fats. They are fat-like molecules. They come from the membrane, which is made of the cell, which is made of fat. And these compounds are produced when we need them, and they're released from the cell. They float, they find the cannabinoid receptor, they bind to the cannabinoid receptor, and they regulate a variety of normal functions in the brain. I'm not going to go even outside the brain. I'm going to stay just in the brain. Feeling, emotion, pain, cognition, which is learning and memory, reward. Some of these are intuitive. We the munchies. So it makes sense that the endocannabinoid system would control feeding, because that's one thing that the munchies are, right? Is craving for Twinkies, right? In fact, it's funny, but that's exactly what it is. The craving, cannabinoids, endocannabinoids control our desire for fatty food, So that explains it sort of intuitively. But other things are less intuitive. For example, cognition. How cannabinoids control cognition? Well, think about this. Have you ever tried, some of your friends, to use while preparing for an exam, right? Not a very good idea, right? And that is what cannabinoids do to memory. They're very much involved in subtle forms of memory. So if you activate the cannabinoid receptor indiscriminately, you end up messing up a lot of the learning that you're doing while you're under the influence of the drug. Okay? So there is a sort of anti-cognitive effect going on. One important thing is reward. What is reward? Is the feeling of gratification that we have when we're doing something we really like. For example, I'm eating this wonderful lasagna that I just baked, and I feel really good. That reward is encoded by specific areas of the brain, the nucleus accumbens in particular, and in the nucleus accumbens, a transmitter called dopamine is released, and we can actually trace, if you were to stick a probe in my brain and measure the level of dopamine as I am tasting that lasagna, you will see the levels going up in that particular region, the nucleus accumbens. Cannabinoid receptors and endocannabinoids in the nucleus accumbens do the same thing, participate in the rewarding experience. So there is a light side to this, but there is also a dark side to this. The dark side is that they are also compounds that can cause dependence, and we'll talk about this later on. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes now to talk from setting aside now the basic science perspective, a more clinical public health perspective, and in particular I'd like to highlight for you this publication here, which is the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine report, which was published in January 2017. Now it's a year and a half old, 2 years old, but still very, very, very timely. So what this book contains is actually the Academy called for a meeting of 16 people, assisted by National Academy staff, who were experts each in a specific discipline. I was the cannabinoid expert, and I had another person who was a clinical cannabinoid expert. The rest were experts in epidemiology, internal medicine, et cetera, et cetera. And we were all tasked with one overarching objective, which is to review the literature since 1999, the last time the National Academy had organized such a committee, reviewed the literature on cannabis. So it happens that we had 24,000 primary studies that we had to look at. And even if you are 16, that's a lot of studies. So we had to make some hard decisions, and we had a day job, so we couldn't be doing this full time, even if we wanted to. So we focused on some specific studies called systematic reviews, which for those of you who are in the public health business, you know what they are. They are specific views in specific articles where people go back to the literature very critically and extract data. And so we looked into those. And after 6 months of work, which isn't a whole lot, believe me, we should have taken a whole lot more time, but we were under pressure. We produced a 468-page report, which is this guy here. It contains 15 conclusions and 4 recommendations. So if you go to the website, picture of this, you have a PDF that will be available to you. If you go to the website of the National Academy, this book is the encyclopedia. It has almost everything. Not for everything will have maybe a satisfactory answer, but it has the current consensus as of 2016, at the end of 2016, the current consensus on cannabis. So what I will do today for you, I will just talk about one aspect, one of the chapters, the therapeutic effects of cannabis. There were a lot of chapters covering the public health effects. So what happens if people use the drug for a long period of time? What happens if they use it in adolescence? What happens if a pregnant mother uses it? All those things were considered, but I'm not going to be talking about them today because it will take me another hour and a half. What I will just focus on is the therapeutic effects. And there is a reason for that. The reason is that it's very important to understand that cannabis has therapeutic utility to understand why the legislation on cannabis is so out of date and so out of touch. We need to understand that. So let me just quickly go over this. And I'll start off by telling you what these things in yellow mean. Conclusive, substantial evidence of effectiveness, moderate evidence of effectiveness, limited evidence of effectiveness. Now, those are not honorific words. Those words, conclusive, substantial, moderate, insufficient, mean specific things. They mean, if it's conclusive, that a certain number of studies in double-blind, placebo-controlled way have been done such that a skeptical scientist would be convinced. When we talk about moderate evidence, this could be something that you say, oh, moderate is not really very important, but it's already a lot of studies. There are already studies there. It's a lot more, it's a lot stronger than what in normal parlance we would say, oh, well, there is moderate evidence. My uncle tried it and it worked for him. No, that's not what we're talking about. That we call anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence, as you know, anecdotes, the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So it's just a different thing. So conclusive, substantial evidence, here these 3 conditions are the only ones for which the committee felt that conclusive and substantial were the right definition. So conclusive, chemotherapy-induced nausea, a very, very important thing. Because for patients with cancer who are taking chemotherapy, nausea, vomit, loss of appetite are life-threatening because they need to stop chemotherapy. They cannot continue the chemotherapy and go on with their lives. And sometimes cannabis and cannabinoids can be a life-saver, and this has been demonstrated in a sufficient number of clinical studies, sufficient to arrive to the conclusion that is conclusive. The evidence is conclusive. Substantial means what the name seems to indicate. Well, it's substantial, but not quite conclusive. And what conditions are we talking about here? Chronic pain in adults, particularly of a neuropathic nature. Not so much inflammatory pain, but neuropathic pain. In that area, there is substantial evidence of effectiveness. Spasticity in MS, also there is substantial evidence of effectiveness. By the way, just to give you a sense, substantial here refers to a cannabis. Cannabis is approved in Canada for the treatment of chronic spasticity in MS. So substantial is substantial. So what about moderate? What about limited? These are all the conditions. You can take a look at the PDF later on for which there is moderate evidence, limited evidence. PTSD, for example, there is a lot of anecdotes out there. A lot of soldiers come back from Iraq, from Afghanistan. They've come back and they tell us the only thing that keeps me alive is using cannabis. Are we to take them seriously? Yes, we are. Are we to believe that that's scientific data? No, we are not. Those are two different things. Taking people seriously and considering that conclusive data are two different things. So this is an area where we need a lot of work. Here are some other therapeutic effects. And those of you who have attended another lecture, another seminar some time ago, I think the symposium on cannabis will be interested in seeing this right on the top of the list here. Insufficient evidence to support or refute. This is exactly what it means. We can't tell. And the first thing that comes is cancer. And yet, if you go on the internet, you will find cancer, particularly this very, very nasty form of cancer, the brain cancer called glioma, as being treated, cured by cannabis. We do not know that. We do not know that. And it doesn't matter how strongly you feel because your cousin tried it and it worked for her. It doesn't matter. It could be a placebo effect. It could be real. We just don't know. We just don't know. So before you go and tell a patient, stop chemotherapy and use THC oil or CBD oil, know that you're taking a big responsibility because you are choosing between something that we know has a limited ability to work, but we know it has some ability to work, and something that we do not know if it works. So I am a big believer in the placebo effect, but I cannot recommend something just based on placebo. I'm not that convincing. So cancer, anorexia, these are all things, by the way, where it may work. I'm not saying that it doesn't work. I say there is insufficient evidence one way or the other. Parkinson's disease is another condition where it may work, but we do not know. There's only one study out there now with power, we call it, number of patients, maybe less than 80 patients, some negative result, but we don't really know. There is also limited evidence of ineffectiveness. So there is some paper suggesting, in fact, that it is ineffective, not just not effective, but just ineffective. And now we're looking at something that really is not working, Alzheimer's disease and glaucoma. Now, I have two asterisks here. Let me just point to these two red asterisks for those of you who don't see them. And there is a reason for this. The first asterisk here is because after we finished our study, a British company by the name of GW Pharmaceutical, we knew about the study, of course, but we did not include it because it was, beyond our time limit. We knew that it was beyond our time limit. Isolated a component of cannabis called cannabidiol, isolated it and completely pure, and tested it in patients with in young people, young children with a form of epilepsy, two different forms of epilepsy, called Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome, and they found it to be effective. So they went to the FDA and they said, here are the data. The compound has got this safety profile, it's got this efficacy profile. The FDA recommended, the panel recommended approval, the FDA approved it, and now it is sold under the name of Epidiolex, and it works. It's used by kids who have these two different conditions. So this is important. But this is not THC, this is CBD, cannabidiol. What about glaucoma? Some of you have heard that cannabis is effective in glaucoma, and it is effective in glaucoma. In fact, the ocular pressure will drop very quickly in glaucoma patients who use cannabis. The problem is that the effect is very short. So the American Ophthalmological Association has decreed that with that short effect, it wasn't worth the risk. So it's considered not effective. So before I move on something more legal, I'd like to bring up the first contradiction that we have, and it happens to be right in our state of California. But every state of the union which has legalized cannabis for medicinal purposes has a list of qualifying conditions for which cannabis can be used. And this is the condition, the list here in California. We got cancer right here. So if you are not an expert, if you are a layperson, and you ask yourself, where do I go to get information about what could be effective? Where do you go? You don't trust the internet. You got to trust your state, don't you? Well, better think it twice, because we know that this guy here is not a condition where cannabis cancer is not a condition where cannabis works. We don't know. We don't know if it does or if it doesn't. But here is listed the first one in the list as if it was now a known and established fact. The list includes all these other things. Here, look, I want you to read this briefly. Any other chronic or persistent medical symptom that substantially limits the ability of a person to conduct, etc., etc. So basically everything. So cannabis now is the typical panacea. It works for everything. Something that works for everything has got another name, snake oil. And that is where I get annoyed, because this kind of stuff, what it does, it actually detracts from the actual utility. If there is usefulness, clinical utility, which I think there is, we are losing because we are saying that it's useful in everything. So 90% of the people will say, no, it doesn't work. And that's bad. These are the two only conditions where we know that it works. And these are the two only conditions that the state should recommend. Now, the state could also accept the use in other conditions at the discretion of a physician. I'm not saying that you put a halt on this. What I'm saying is that recommending is one thing, accepting is a different thing. In this case, we're looking at a qualified list, so very, very, very unrealistic. So let me move on now to the more legal aspect of my talk, and I want to reintroduce the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. So the first big legislation in this country was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. It was enacted under, well, in a second. First, the 1970 was enacted in the Richard Nixon administration, and what it did, it was actually quite organic. It was very systematic. It basically divided drugs that work on the brain, more or less psychoactive drugs, into 5 classes or schedules. And the higher the number, 1 to 5, the lower the risk. And 3 parameters were set as defining factors in this risk. And those are accepted medical use, potential for abuse, high potential for abuse, and lack of accepted safety. So abuse has to be high to be in Schedule 1, the risk of abuse. Medical use has to be nil, no medical use whatsoever. And there must be no level of safety. Okay, those are the 3 conditions to be in Schedule 1. Schedule 5 is a lot less. I mean, what do we have in Schedule 5 here? For those of you who cannot read at the back, we got Robitussin. Yeah, Phenergan with codeine. I mean, this is stuff that you can buy if you have a serious cough, for example, you get some Robitussin, right? This is where cannabis is, in the highest, strictest schedule, Schedule 1, along with LSD, heroin, peyote, MDMA, ecstasy, methaqualone. This is where cannabis is. So, and this is a photograph of when the CSA was signed by Richard Nixon. So I want to clarify immediately one thing, because I think that's important. This is clearly a political decision. Creating the CSA, enacting it, was a political decision. Nixon had created a scientific committee that looked at the problem, and the scientific committee did not recommend the scheduling of cannabis. In fact, they recommended not to schedule it. But Nixon didn't pay any attention to that. And so one might think, oh, okay, so we have a certain part of the political spectrum is against cannabis. Unfortunately, that's not that simple. It's a part of our culture, because the gentleman that actually created the Marijuana Tax Act is this gentleman here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is not considered a very conservative president. So the point is not being conservative or being liberal here. The point is understanding the role that science has in helping shape statutes, legislation that is close to reality in response to the need of the people. There are other things. They are not just science. I am not a science absolutist. I believe that culture, society play as important a role, and those are not scientific things. 5 minutes already? Oh my God! I gotta go quickly. Forget about it. So let me just go quickly to the point here. The point here is that if you take a plant and you criminalize it, you're criminalizing a whole bunch of different things. And all of a sudden, the only problem you're left over is how do you study these things? I can go into this. I want to get to the core of the matter, and here is the core of the matter. We know that cannabinoids, THC, through these actions I described to you before, has therapeutic applications. We also know that it may cause dependence. I talked to you about reward and what is at the basis of dependence. But it's very modest to other drugs, such as, for example, heroin, such as, for example, nicotine, such as, for example, cocaine. A lot more moderate. So these facts contradict two basic tenets of the classification of cannabis as Schedule 1. That is, there is medical use, and there is no high potential for abuse. Those are contradicted by the data. Similarly, when we talk about lack of accepted safety, I'm bringing this up again because I want to point out this particular region of the brain to you, the so-called pre-Botzinger complex. This is a region of the brain that controls breathing. Of course, you don't think about breathing. You breathe naturally, automatically. And that is because we have neurons here that are pattern generators. They generate action potentials that will move our muscles without us thinking about that. And there are a ton of opioid receptors here, and that is the reason why if one overdoses on fentanyl, one dies. Respiratory blockade. There is no cannabinoid receptor here. You cannot die of a cannabinoid overdose. In fact, the dose that it takes to kill me would be approximately 53 grams of THC. So if you buy a chocolate bar, it's about 100 grams. You take half of it, and it's not chocolate. Now it's all pure THC. You eat that, and you have 50%, a man of my size, 50% chances of dying. Not very likely. In comparison, caffeine, 192 milligram per kilogram, which is almost 10 times less, and nicotine, which is a very strong poison. Actually, if you buy it for research purposes, it's got a little skull on the bottle, 60 milligram per kilogram. So this contradicts the third basic tenet of scheduling. All right? So I don't want to go into this because it's too long, and this is too long as well. But I want to show you will have there is a state of confusion, and here's what happens because of the law. Because of the CSA, here is what happens. If you are an environmental scientist, okay, and you want to study, for example, what happens to a village of folks who live near a very vast cultivation of cannabis. You are in environmental science at University of California, Riverside, and you want to do that, right? You can't, because you cannot take a sample into your lab because that's forbidden by the law. You can't do that. If you are a clinical investigator or a preclinical investigator, as I am, and you want to study cannabis, here is what you need to do. This is what you need. This is the red tape you have to go through in order to be able to start a study. You can read it if you're interested as a PDF. I won't bother you with the gory details, but there is even a little kicker. When it arrives, everything is done, and you have done all. This takes a year, by the way. When all this is done, and you arrive to the point that you are ordering the product, you cannot go to the store and get the product that other people are getting. You have to take it from the University of Mississippi because they are the monopoly. And they don't produce the best cannabis in the world. Right? I mean, I am no expert, at least not from that perspective, but I don't think it is. So here's the last slide, and it's a proposed path forward. And this is actually a path forward that is not just my making. I have brought together a bunch of experts from the University of California, our great institution, and this is what we came up with. It's up in the Journal of Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research in the month of March. The first thing we were proposing is reschedule cannabis. Reschedule cannabis away from Schedule 1. It makes no sense. That's not where it belongs. It belongs to Schedule 3. That's where it belongs. It has to be scheduled because it is a substance that causes dependence. We know that. Maybe not addiction, but certainly dependence. And this is where it belongs. CBD, cannabidiol, is not psychoactive, and it should not be scheduled. Period. Now the Farm Bill, the Farm Act, which was just enacted early on this year, actually goes in that direction. But we will need to see how the law gets implemented to see how actually this happens. Importantly, all other 138 cannabinoids in the plant should not be scheduled either, because the only substance there that is responsible for intoxication is THC, not the others. So science tells us that only THC is scheduled, not the others. But the first thing that I'm going to say to this audience, because I am, within the University of California Center, the first thing that we need is freedom to do research, support for research, freedom to do research. Right now, we don't have that freedom. If, as a private citizen, I want to buy 100 milligrams of THC in a single beverage, I can go to the closest dispensary and do that. As a scientist, I have a year of paperwork to do before I can get 10 milligrams to the lab, and I got cops in my lab showing up regularly to make sure that that 10 milligram is stored in a steel safe inside a steel -80 freezer inside a closed door room in a locked building. And I am not kidding you. It is exactly what it is. So who is this legislation for? What is it for? Clearly, it is to impede research. It's the only thing. There's the only reason for this. And I'm sorry if I get annoyed about this and a little bit perhaps too passionate, but I guess that's what I do, and can't help it. So with this, I am done. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit too. It took me a lot longer than I thought.